Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Saltzman from Org Vitality. Welcome to our webinar on storytelling. I have the honor and privilege of introducing not only the topic to you, but also our presenter today. Before we get into that, let me hit a couple of administrative tasks. You will be getting a copy of the slides at the conclusion of today's webinar. So anybody who's signed up and attended, expect to get an email from us with the slides attached. We will be trying to save some time at the end of the webinar to answer any questions that you have. If you notice in your control box where the webinar controls are, there's a place where you can click to put any questions. A number of us will be monitoring that question box throughout the webinar, and we're going to try and save 5-10 minutes at least at the end to respond to as many questions as we can. Certainly, if we don't get to your questions, we'd be happy for you to reach out or for us to contact you and have some more detailed discussions about any questions that you might have. So let me first start by saying a little bit about storytelling. I could tell you facts and figures about the founding of our company back in 2009 now, or I could tell you a story about it. And telling you a story about it is going to be much more memorable long-term to you than if I were to tell you just simple facts and figures about when we started the company. And Scott's going to delve into some of the rationale, the reasons there, what makes a good story, the power of a story, and so forth. And I've heard this webinar now a couple of times, and he tells a good yarn. So I hope you enjoy his take on storytelling as much as I do. Storytelling itself, by the way, is a chapter. Well, let me tell you a little bit about Scott. Scott is our presenter today. Scott is a PhD in industrial organizational psychology. Scott and I have been working together now for quite a long period of time. And each time I hear him do one of these webinars, there's always some kind of new nugget that I'm able to take away. So it's a thoroughly enjoyable experience. In terms of where this webinar came from, Scott and I wrote a book. It's been I guess it's about a year and a half now since this has been published, or coming up on a year and a half. It's called Creating the Vital Organization, Balancing Short-Term Profits with Long-Term Success. And we talk about the power, one of the chapters talks about the power of stories in organizations and what they can accomplish for organization. And so one of the things we did is we took a number of these chapters from the book and we turned them into webinars, and they've been in general very well received. So that is the topic of today's webinar. So without any further ado, let me turn it over to Scott. Spin your yarn, Scott.
Well, thanks, Jeff. Appreciate the introduction, and this is one of those topics that is, it's fun. So let's step back, and I want to start with one general question first, which is, what is the power of a story? Whether we've thought about it or not, I think we all intuitively know that stories connect us. They help share ideas and goals and values. Stories captivate, educate, maybe inspire. And within an organization, which is the focus of this webinar, stories bind people together. They humanize top leaders. They can motivate employees. And in fact, you might say that the culture of your organization is shaped by the stories that people tell when you're not in the room. And in fact, that's one of my favorite definitions of culture, which is, what are the stories people tell when you, as a leader, you're not in the room. Certainly over the past decade, storytelling has become increasingly and formally recognized as an important part of organizational life. Storytelling has inspired new leadership research. It's inspired full-on consulting business industries, and even the job title of chief storyteller, which you may or may not want, but it's there. And certainly, though, storytelling has always been important. So I'm going to start with a little story. So this is a snippet from one of the great storytellers, a guy named Garrison Keillor, who up to about a year and a half ago was the host of a of a Minnesota public radio program called the Prairie Home Companion. And so the setting here is a smoky bar with an individual named Guy Noir, who's a private eye, talking to a woman in this bar. And this is in the middle of a larger scene of a radio show. And this woman says, "I need management. I'm lost, Mr. Noir. I have no idea where I am or what I'm doing." And Guy Noir says, "You're in a bar called the Five Spot. You're drop dead beautiful. You're sitting on a bar stool next to a guy in his extremely late 40s whose cardiovascular system you are doing things to that you wouldn't believe." And she says, "You sound like a consultant." And he says, "How's that?" And he says, "Well, everything you say is technically correct, but it's of no use whatsoever." Now, the scene goes on and in a couple of different ways, and then Guy Noir eventually says, "Well, maybe you've been in management too long." And she says, "How's that?" And he says, "You don't know where you are, where you're going, but because I can't help you, now it's my fault." Now, that's funny. Why is this funny? It's funny because it rings true to us. It rings true with what we're trying to do. Oftentimes we respond with facts. We don't necessarily respond with something that's useful. So what's the rub? What can we say? Where do we go from here? Well, another way to think about this is a quote from a well-known writer and thinker, Alfred Whitehead, who says, "We think in generalities, but we live in detail." And this is partly the problem with Guy Noir's approach. What is the problem with organizational effectiveness interventions, change management, the leadership of big systems, and so forth? The idea is that we think and talk and communicate to others in concepts and generalities and perhaps some data, and maybe we use spreadsheets and graphs and PowerPoint, but we live in detail. We want the storyline. We want the narrative of our lives. We want to connect with people, not connect with spreadsheets or big data analyses. So enter stories. And if you were to step back and think about, like, what are some of the biggest stories in our culture today? And let me narrow that a little bit by saying, what are some of the biggest stories in terms of movies or cinema and the box office take? And you couldn't get very far without thinking about the Marvel movies about superheroes, Iron Man, Spider-Man, Thor, and the like. And in fact, this franchise has earned almost $20 billion in worldwide box office takes. So I'm going to step into this kind of story and think about what's one of the best parts of a superhero story. And it's the origin. All superheroes have origin stories, and we love them. And the most compelling superhero stories have two interwoven parts. The first is what makes a superhero super, right? How do they get their powers? How do they get strong? How do they fight? What are they good at? And so forth and so on. The second part to a superhero origin story that's great is, why are they a hero, right? This is a little different. It's like, why do they do good in the world? What drives them to do what they do? Or if they're a supervillain, what is it that drives them to be evil? Take Spider-Man, for example, here on the side. I'm sure that many of you know this story, but it's about a high school kid named Peter Parker who developed his abilities after being bitten by a radioactive spider, or in some of the movie adaptations, by a genetically modified spider. But that's how he got good, right? The spider conveyed super spider powers. But he was driven to be a hero by his guilt over his Uncle Ben's murder, and from a moral center and a human center provided by his Aunt May. Now, those are two different parts to Spider-Man, and sometimes they conflict, and that makes for a great character and a great origin story. And you might think about, first time you might have encountered Spider-Man, it might be that the concept of a superhuman being with spider-like powers might have made you interested at first. But what made you stick with him was his personal mission and his character arc, and in fact, what makes him a hero. So that's all fine and good for Marvel. How do we extend this into organizations? Let's look into that for a second. What are the two best parts of an organization's origin story, right? Well, let's look at this. Well, what makes an organization super? This is, how do you succeed, right? What are you good at? What are your competencies? Where do you beat the competition? What can you do that no other organization can do? right? That's important. Now, the other part of it is what makes you a hero. And what makes an organization a hero, I don't mean this in the sense of let's all run around as individuals and save the day, but collectively as an organization. Why do organizations do what they do? What's their mission? Organizations have a choice of turning left or turning right or making it blue or making it red or whatever it is. All these choices happen all the time. And why do you choose some or over the other? What are the things that guide you? And this is the force that might compel you to make a difference in the world, to grow, and it might drive efforts to self-improve and endure in a different way. And these two sides of an origin story are kind of like what makes you successful today, what drives current performance, and what might bring you back after today's battle to tomorrow, which is future potential. That's actually the theme of the book that Jeff introduced at the beginning, and how this kind of origin story plays into that. And so, you know, you could think about this as an example of using stories in the culture, like a superhero origin story, to help articulate and tie to what is happening in your organization. And you can think of your own organizations now. It's like there could be these two separate origin stories in your organization. So take a second, think about that. Think about your own organization. What makes it super? What makes it effective in execution? And then what makes it a hero? What makes it endure, and what makes it drive forward, and what sort of defines its mission? So I'm gonna do a little poll here for a second and ask that question because I'm curious as to what people would say. And the poll here that I'm going to open, you should see it on your screen now. It's like, which side of this origin story in your organization has a better story? Is it that you're good about talking about your power, how you succeed, what you're good at, how you compete, what are your competencies? Or are you better at talking about your mission, you know, why you strive, what defines the future you that you want to be? Or are both actually pretty good and balanced, or do you struggle with both? So take some time, answer the poll. I've got, I'm seeing here that people are responding and the numbers are ticking up. All right, we'll give it just a second. All right, most of you have responded. If you haven't, click something. Okay. Maybe wait for one more. You know who you are. Check a box. All right, we're good. Let me share the results. Interesting. I'm not sure I would have expected this, that better at talking about your mission, you know, why you strive. And only 15% of everybody started talking about, you know, the power, but there's a good balance. Okay, well, you know, I think part of this illustrated is that you think about things a little differently. So, you know, at Org Vitality, we often tell stories from data. We do this all the time with our clients, and one frequent way we cast these database stories is explicitly this. What makes an organization good? What are they good at today? And how do they move into the future? And what might provide the guidance and the messaging about that? So I'm going to transition a little bit now to how to tell better stories. Right? So what is the discipline of storytelling? I'm going to spend a little time unweaving this. Now, if you're like a lot of people, many would say that they would only tell stories if they knew some good ones. I'm not buying that. In fact, there's a really concise quote that's attributed to a lot of people. I'm going to ascribe it to Ira Glass, who's the host of a national public radio show in the United States called This American Life. He says, stories that happen to those who can tell them. And what is the point of this? This says that if you think about the people around you, think about the people who are telling stories around you, it's often the same people. Now, it's not likely that these people magically have more interesting things happening in their lives. It's more likely that these are the people who notice and recount things in a compelling way. What does this mean? this implies that telling stories is not based on what you see or what happens to you. This implies that it's a skill, and it's all that in turn implies that it's a skill you can learn to do better. So you learn to tell stories and the content will come. So from this, what are some of the content areas we can keep an eye out for? Well, stories that are often told in business include origin stories, right? We talked about this one. There is the nature of our challenge story. This is why we're doing what is unique or important. There's the striving to improve story. How do we get better? The coming together story, which is how do we bond as people despite our differences in order to be together and to serve something greater. There are performance tales that are triumph, like how the Post-it notes were met with initial skepticism until those clever inventors at 3M got their own administrative assistants hooked, then cut off supply, right? There is how the organization took care of its employees story, not just the stated stories about, we believe in people, but the demonstrated organizational values of the organization. There's the where we're going story. We're not just predicting, but we are defining the future. One quick story along these lines, we talk about how we love origin stories. One of my favorites is Les Wexner, the founder of Limited Brands in Columbus, Ohio. He borrowed money from his aunt on the sly in order to open up a business to prove a point to his dad about how certain types of clothing were more profitable than others, and that in fact an apparel store that was limited to lower cost price point basics like socks and underwear would make more money. That was great, and he succeeded. But we also love triumph stories, not just origin stories, stories that reflect our values, and we also love train wreck stories, right? Those that tell of disaster, intrigue, thievery, general nastiness. I'm not going to spend as much time on those, even though stories about failure told in the right ways are really important. But the stories about general nastiness and fear generally don't move an organization forward as much. But whatever the story is, all of these things move us. They humanize our leaders by suggesting they're either fallible or great. They serve as dramatic examples of ethics, perhaps, and demonstrate whether those leaders are deserving of our respect or not. So what you want to do is maybe pick a couple of buckets here and listen for stories, and you will get better, right? But what's a good story? And I want to move now to what makes a story effective, what makes it succeed. And for now, keep in mind a story that an executive or leader might tell in your organization, either on stage, in a webinar, in a video to all staff, in a town hall meeting, that kind of thing. And when leaders tell stories, there are 4 truths to effective organization stories. And these are based on a veteran Hollywood filmmaker, Peter Gruber, who has distilled the lessons from his Hollywood industry into these 4 truths. So when are they more effective? The first is truth to the teller. And as Gruber says, the storyteller's tongue, feet, and wallet must move in the same direction. In other words, what I say, what I do, and how I spend my precious resources should be consistent. And this is a mark of a storyline that reflects something consistent with the storyteller's value and style. And part of this is that the basic message of a story won't change in subsequent versions. It's consistent to the person. And in fact, some of the most potent stories we tell and retell are about decisions that cost us money, but pursue some value that's more important, like employee safety or integrity with customers. When do I sacrifice profits for a larger goal? That makes a huge storytelling opportunity. Employees often never know top leaders directly, but they know it through stories. And one simple illustration is a president of a healthcare delivery organization that I was working with a few years back in the southeastern United States. This president once expressed some dismay at a low employee survey score about whether or not managers used good ideas that employees had. And she said, they just don't know how much they keep me awake at night. And that simple statement drifted out of that conference room and into more general awareness of the organization. It helped humanize that president and credibly reflected the messages that she told. The second truth is truth to the audience. And, compelling stories will start with what an audience values and cares about, and not what the top leaders necessarily value and care about. Gruber here tells a story of a woman named Sally Krawcheck, who held CEO positions at Smith Barney and a Citigroup unit. And she was known as someone who would draw in her audiences, citing a common bond of awkward preteen years. And she would say, there was nothing they could do to me at Solomon Brothers in the 80s that was worse than the 7th grade. Now, just that sentence, immediately you're drawn into that, and you find yourself listening to the person and not just the facts and figures that she might recite. You can contrast that with another president of a professional services organization that I've worked with in the past, who consistently and too much tried to connect with his audience by talking about all the cash that the organization had accumulated and had available to devote to various business development efforts. Now, talking about cash can be fine, but what the audience actually heard was the disconnect between a rich organization and the low wages that these employees themselves were paid. The leader was starting with what was important to him and not what was important to the audience. And leaders will often tell their stories of confidence in the future based on their own sense of market forces, a bunch of spreadsheet-based metrics and some intimate decision-making sessions that are closed doors to most people. But the most compelling stories of the future have to start with what the audience values and cares about, not the top leaders. And how often in your own work, whatever job you have you seen that executives are just in a different place than their employees at large? The answer is all the time. And in fact, in our work, we're able to split out employee opinions of leaders and employee opinions of everybody else and see where they're different and how potentially disconnected the leadership is from what other people are thinking and feeling. The next truth is truth to the moment. And we're not talking about verbatim or regurgitated reflex, right? We are talking about something that is powered by passion in that moment. You think about this, you always love a speech when a leader is standing up there, picks up his or her notes and tosses them aside and says, I'm going to go off script. That draws you in, and you feel like something special is coming and something that's unique to that time and that moment, and you're a part of it. And for any story to be gripping and compelling, they need to feel genuine at that time. Now, this is not to say they can't be told and retold or different versions. So stories don't always have to be spontaneous. Being genuine is different than being spontaneous and new, right? Even if you've heard it before, when a great storyteller will recount a tale, you have the sense that it's not this verbatim script or regurgitated reflex, but it is in fact powered by the passion of that moment. And this is a skill that can be developed. Paradoxically, while storytelling seems like it should come from the heart and not from rehearsal, it still benefits quite a deal from discipline and preparation. And this is very obvious for those of you who, and I'm sure it's probably most or all of you, the popularity of TED Talks. And so many of them begin almost formulaically with a personal story about the teller, the presenter, and what brought them to this point in their talk. And then they launch into something that's potentially very sophisticated or a technical topic. It can be a formula, but it works. And even though they're very rehearsed, they feel true to the moment. Now, the last truth here is truth to the mission, in the sense that the story must echo something larger than either that one story or that one storyteller. And this happens when it's clear that the leader or the storyteller is devoted to a cause that's larger than him or herself. Origin stories told by founders, are compelling because the launching of a business is virtually synonymous with the entrepreneurial passion to create something amazing that hadn't existed before. And that creation is so often the story of an underdog beating the odds, or some sort of really clever, ingenious duct tape and paperclip solution that worked. And you hear the emotional backdrop that predated any success that helps tie a leader to an organization and to the mission, and it motivates the audience to participate in continued success. Now, clearly, not all missions are success stories, and not all tellers are part of an origin story, but the devotion to something larger than oneself is the compelling part. So to this point, I've asked you to think about stories that leaders tell, on stage and town hall meetings and so forth. But it's also very true that stories are not just grand and sweeping narratives. Not all stories are told on stage. I had the good fortune several years back to meet a man named Masa Tanaka, who at the time was the president and CEO of Union Bank, based out here in San Francisco. And he kept a giant rubber ear in his desk. He was a Japanese expatriate running a US company, and that stirred into the pot of his pre-existing values. He knew that he needed to stay calibrated to the voice of employees, right? So often when an employee would come speak to him, or me, for example, he would pull out a rubber ear from his desk there, and he would hold it up to his own ear, and he would keep a very serious demeanor and maybe cock his head and open his eyes a little wider, as if he were listening intently. And he used this big rubber ear to make the point that he understood the need to listen. And importantly, it wasn't just that he was listening, but he was also reminding all of his other executives that they needed to listen as well. And in the process, he created this lasting image in the minds of others that prompted them to tell stories. Have you seen Masa's ear? That's an opener to a story. Stories abound about CEOs. You think about any CEO that your organization or another, and there are stories all the time. What they do, what they value, who they are. People try to make sense of leaders above them. And Masa, with his ear, he helped shape the stories around him. So here's a question for you. What do you want your stories to say about you, especially when you're not in the room? I'm going to take a quick metaphorical sidebar here on metaphors. Now, in our work at Org Vitality, we do, among other things, a lot of employee surveys, a lot of HR metrics, a lot of data work about people. And here are 3 quick metaphors we often use in our work that are not just like Masa's ear, but a little different. Number 1, change, organizational change is like New Year's resolutions. Especially evidence-based change is like standing on the scale on New Year's Eve and deciding you want to lose 20 pounds. And then the hard part, of course, is not the measurement of it, but what is the way that you commit to a resolution after March to stick either with your diet of eating better or your exercise plan of getting out and getting more exercise. But because heaven knows you can't do both, eating better and eating right. Well, that's kind of tough. So I'll just pick one. So anyway, you can play with that resolution metaphor. Second, really fast one is employee engagement. It's kind of like gas in the tank. What does that mean? A full tank is no guarantee. An empty tank certainly prevents any progress. But you ask the question, what does engagement do for you? It powers the engine in your metaphorical organizational car. And the unique bits about your organization isn't really the gas. That's in fact the most generic thing across any car. But the unique thing, are you a hybrid? Are you a Jeep? Are you a minivan? Are you a moped or a tiny little scooter? It's the engine that is often the interesting part that gets you where you're going. Obviously, there can be more on that. You can play with it. But another one is that, change agents or facilitators or human resources, they're like personal trainers. It's not a personal trainer's job to do your sit-ups for you, right? It's not HR's job to do your work for you. But this support function can be a coach, a champion, a guide. It can support you and help you live up to your own good intentions. Now, obviously, I just blasted through these. The value of metaphors is first that it makes things easier to remember and to recount. And second, and more deeply, they help convey a richer message than just a simple statement. They connect ideas and thoughts and emotions in our heads and different things together to advance how we think or even feel about something. And maybe, by the way, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, to help illustrate this point, you might remember how employee engagement is really just the gas gauge of an organization's effectiveness. And there can be other gauges, other indicators that are perhaps more important for your model of car. who drives around without a GPS now anymore anyway? But I want to move from this to how we tell stories and how to drive a message that gets told and hopefully retold. So I'm going to draw upon some tips from literary techniques. Now, you don't need to do all these things, exactly, but we'll walk through them and hopefully they'll open you up to better storytelling in general. So first, suspense. Yeah, okay, we're going to come back to this one. Second, melodrama. So what is melodrama? Well, melodrama is everything's urgent, everything's critical, a must win, we got a burning platform. And really, in an organization, it's a sense of manufactured urgency from fear rather than compelling opportunity. And interestingly, there is research that talks about, does fear motivate? What kind of stories, what kind of messages motivate? And fear can motivate, surely, but the kind of thing it motivates is more inaction or rigidity rather than action and creation. And in fact, one quick thing is, fear of harming one's child is what leads some, against the face of overwhelming medical evidence, not to vaccinate a baby, right? That fear leads to that inaction and lack of vaccinations, which it clearly runs in the face of evidence and data. And so what's the tip here? Well, hope is what inspires action. That's more sustainable, and that's typically where we want to be. And so avoiding melodrama, you want to ignite passions and join people together by articulating compelling and potentially audacious goals. Let me give you a quick couple of examples. First one, again, from movies. I'm not sure how many of you would have seen the 2004 Disney movie Miracle, which recounts the true story of the United States men's hockey team that won a gold medal in the 1980 Winter Olympics, and defeating Russia was the defining moment. And there, at that moment, Coach Herb Brooks, no relation, although I'm sure I could invent a story about that, at a critical moment in that game during Russia, he says, "Tonight, we are the greatest hockey team in the world. You were born to be hockey players, every one of you. You were meant to be here tonight. This is your time." Like, wow, what does that do? It's all about pulling people together, work as a team, emphasize what's at stake, and that's truth to the moment, right? Or here's another one. October 1987, the new CEO of Alcoa, Paul O'Neill, gave his maiden speech to shareholders. And what it said, he says, "If you want to understand how Alcoa is doing, you need to look at our workplace safety figures. If we bring our injury rates down, it won't be because of cheerleading or the nonsense you sometimes hear from other CEOs. It will be because individuals at this company have agreed to become part of something important. They've devoted themselves to creating a habit of excellence. Safety will be an indicator that we're making progress and changing our habits across the entire institution. That's how we should be judged." Like, wow, that's pretty cool. I want to work for that guy. He could talk about safety as a problem. He could have talked about safety as danger and fear and disaster, but instead he talks about coming together and being a part of something bigger, and this is how we will be judged. Like, that's cool. Both these examples are certainly stirring, and they emphasize bringing people together to do important things greater than themselves. That can do so much more than melodrama and just arguing about a burning platform. And if you want another example, go find Kennedy's speech about his moonshot, where he talks about opportunity more than just fear and the Cold War. Let's move to another literary example called character arc. Our favorite stories show how protagonists change. So think about your favorite stories, movies, books, literature. The ones that are most impactful show how the protagonist will change. If a protagonist doesn't change through a story, yeah, sure, it might be entertaining, but it's not moving. And really, the character arc is that somebody wants a goal, can't get a goal, there's barriers. You act to get a goal, and then at the end, you've got a changed attitude about your goal. You're in a different place. Some quick examples: Mulan. This is another Disney movie. It starts with an I Wish song. That's a literary technique. In fact, The Wizard of Oz starts with the I Wish song too, that defines the goal that the main character wants, right? And in Mulan, it's a story about a young woman who, yeah, sure, she saves China, but the main character arc is about her outer self reflecting the inner self that she's always felt to be true in her. Another, Star Wars, okay? This is back again in our box office take, but Luke Skywalker famously reflects Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Joseph Campbell was a comparative mythologist, and George Lucas based so much of the Star Wars story on this thing called the hero's journey. And you know, you think about a transformation of an orphan boy who is someone outside the center of action, looking in, wishing for excitement, learns about powers that he didn't have, reconciles with the legacy of his father. No, I'm not talking about Harry Potter. I am still talking about Star Wars, but it's a common enough thing and it works. We've got Pride and Prejudice, where that's about the main characters overcoming just that, pride and prejudice. We've got Iron Man, to go back to superheroes for a minute. It's more than an action movie because we invest ourselves in Tony Stark's change. We have Groundhog Day. It plays with this idea where it's not the day that changes. It's stuck in a movie on Groundhog Day that plays over and over again, but the character, Bill Murray's, changes. And that, in fact, is the only thing that changes. And, you know, then, of course, we go to classics where the main character has a major revelation and epiphany on his own life. Now, the most impactful organization stories also show this kind of human transformation. You know, leaders, when they say, here's what I wish I'd known. Here's what I thought was important, but now we know better. Those are stories that have power. They're about arc. They're about learning and growing together. Ironically, if you're a politician, sometimes changing your opinion is punished, where stability might be valued over growth based on new data, new experiences, new learning. But in organizations, that's not where we want to play. So I promised it. I want to go back to suspense for a minute. And this is not about annoying people with artificially inefficient communication, right? Instead, it's about building anticipation and excitement that can help your message get through. So consider two stories. Here's the first one. One executive said, hey, we made $4 million on this particular deal. All right, you know, it's fine. Got some facts, figures, and it's got the outcome. But what happens if we say, you know what, I was recently talking to this executive and he leaned back in his leather chair, creaking as he leaned forward, and then recounted how he narrowly missed his flight home and was struck overnight in China. And the beautiful, spacious hotel where he spent the previous few nights was fully booked, and he was lucky to get a room at a rundown inn owned by a local husband and wife who fed him a traditional Chinese meal. The executive details the delicious food, explaining how he overcame the language barrier enough to communicate with the husband and the wife to learn that they wanted to sell their inn. And he talks about buying the inn and turning it into a first-rate hotel, and ends with a triumph. We made $4 million on that deal, and all because I just missed that first flight. Now, that's a story that has greater impact on the listener, and it sticks a little bit more than just hearing about a new hotel that made $4 million. And in fact, there is some research that's continuing that describes how listening to a story with setting and arc and this kind of detail and maybe anticipation, we as the audience track with, not against the storyteller, right? We are more open to facts and figures by the time they get there. And in fact, even brain scans look at how the brains of the audience become aligned with the storyteller, so that by the time the punchline comes around, we're already there. And even in database presentations, you don't need to go through details about food and language barriers, but just saying something at the beginning of a presentation like, look, this is an exciting story, found some things that surprised even me, and I'm here to tell you about it. And in fact, you're going to see a couple of threads by the time we get to the end that will have come together, and hopefully you will find compelling. I mean, that's small. But even that sets up a sense of anticipation, you know, not the creaky leather chair kind of thing, but some anticipation nonetheless. Now, I've been focusing mostly on executives telling their own stories, or you might maybe telling your own story, but that's important. But and you will want to tell your own stories, but the real impact for you If you're a leader, if you're an organizational consultant or otherwise trying to make organizational change, the real impact is in the stories that other people tell when you're not in the room. After you deliver a presentation to executives, what do they talk about when you're gone, right? If you have a little bit of an on-stage event, or you're talking to a leader trying to inspire something, what happens when you leave the room or the next day? Let me give you a couple of points about helping other people tell stories. First, some research is revealed here that people who tell stories tend to be those who are more committed to an organization. All right, that's awesome. How do we use that? Well, it suggests that stories told tend to be more pro-organization than anti-organization. So we can plunge in and say, all right, let's just have stories get told. It also suggests that you could target some of those employees who are more committed and help them tell the stories that maybe be percolating underneath, right? How do we do this? Well, we can develop a storytelling discipline within an organization. And we might do this by encouraging and listening and repeating stories that your own employees have to tell. So repeat other people's stories. And as alluded to before, this is a discipline that can be built, and so practice matters. What are some other ways to help people create their own stories? Well, something that is maybe not often thought of but hugely powerful is, how do you create events that might spawn their own stories? Let me give you some quick examples. Real simply, a lame duck award. What is this? Well, it's an award of grand failure in innovation. Something that is well conceived, that might have worked, but turned out to be a waste of time and money. But that's in the end. In the process, it was valuable to work it to its end. And we celebrate that process. And maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 100, maybe that's how many times it might work. That could be plenty. But the process of pursuing things that are risky can be valuable. Here's another one. Town hall meeting where I attended a little while back. Top executives inscribed on scraps of paper practices that they themselves and others around them were pledging to stop, and they ceremoniously threw them into the coffin, and then the coffin was marched out to the parking lot and burned. It's very exciting, very different, but it was something that had other people telling stories about that day. Another quick one, healthcare organization. This was actually based in Colorado in the United States. They set out one day with leaders and union representatives and other facilitators, and they approached every employee who came into work that day. They instructed them to come up with an idea to improve patient care, customer service, and tell it to their boss. Then they moved on. They gave a piece of candy and a little card as a reminder. But what this happened is it created a buzz and activity in an organization that had all this happening. And people, even several years later, it's like, remember that day when everybody came around and, talked about patient care. And in fact, they loved it so much, a few years later, they did it for patient safety. And then if you want to go completely audacious, not everybody can do this, but in 1978, after 2 EDS executives had been taken hostage by the Iranian government, Ross Perot, who was, EDS was his organization, he tasked a retired Colonel Bull Simmons. And the fact that his name is even Bull is, you can't make this stuff up, right? He assembled a team of Vietnam veterans from EDS's own workforce to go rescue his own people. How much truth to the teller is this? How much does this demonstrate Ross Perot's values? If you were to do this and send all your people into danger and fund it yourself, that story tells itself. And that would be an organization where you say, all right, whatever we are as a business, whatever we're doing today, I know Ross Perot's values because of this kind of thing, right? So, think about, and the point of this is like, how do you create an environment where stories might tell themselves? We don't always have the opportunity to run off and launch a military action in another country. But how do you do something audacious, something big that gets remembered, that demonstrates the you that you want to be? Now, as we start to wind down, there is an important point about stories that I need to convey. The Spider-Man's Uncle Ben, he says, with great power comes great responsibility. And this is in fact one of the reasons why Superman becomes a hero with all of his power, and he becomes a force for good. And there is this paradox of stories, that fiction is often called the lie that tells the truth. What does that mean? Well, think of some of the literature that you most love to read, whether it's Mark Twain or Shakespeare or that book you picked up in the airport last week. The best fiction, the fiction that moves us, the fiction that we remember, is speaking to us about human truths, right? So it's a lie, it's fiction that tells the truth. It says something bigger about what it is and what we like and what we want and who we are. And you can match that up with the fact that authenticity tends to be emotional, not factual. It's a demonstration of values, not of facts and figures. Our brains are wired to make sense of the world in narrative. And what this means is that stories often work with, not against, cognitive biases and heuristics. Stories are easier to remember than facts and figures, and easier to retell. And in fact, this plays right into something called the availability heuristic in psychology, which is the inclination to rate as more probable cases that come more easily to mind, right? So if my cousin just tells me about some story about how leaving my car unlocked, I'm going to get robbed, and his car was unlocked and it's going to rob, I'm going to rate the incidence of car robbery as higher because I can remember that story. Even if I just read something in the newspaper that gave me the exact fact and figure. So that story plays into that bias. Or there's also something called the conjunction fallacy. No test on this, don't worry about it. But it's the tendency that we give more weight to detailed explanations than to simple ones. That's essentially the same thing as giving more weight to a story than just a simpler concept. Now, it is absolutely important to educate and develop resistance to cognitive biases, right? Cognitive biases can get in our way. They might be useful in some cases. They're in our brains because shortcuts help us think faster and better and typically more clearly about an environment, but they can lead us astray. At the same time, it's similarly important to embrace this part of human nature and acknowledge this power of storytelling and use stories to your advantage. A compelling narrative transports us into the action, and rather than stepping back and maybe critically evaluating a message, we step into it and ride along with the storyteller. That's the strength of stories, but that's also the challenge for you to use your power for good, right? Once you get good at storytelling, you want to use your power for good, and this goes back to Uncle Ben. With great power in storytelling comes great responsibility. Now, how might you do that? Well, you want to tell stories that are correct, right? You want to tell stories that are accurate and useful and sort of true to what you know. And so, I think a number of you in the audience are technical experts of one sort or another, and you probably often try to drive organizational change based on some sort of technical project or data. And so here's a primer for telling stories and data. First, know what you believe. Create conclusions as if you had to defend them to a panel of critical experts. My own background is in industrial and organizational psychology. I always picture standing up in front of a big room at our annual conference and saying what I'm about to say, maybe to executives or something like that. And if I cannot stand up in front of that room and defend what I am about to say, then I need to go back and really think about my technical foundations and so forth. But once I know what I believe and know the conclusion that I want to drive towards, I might step back and scrap everything I did to get me to there and consider the audience. What convinces me might not be what convinces the audience, right? So your audience might come from different backgrounds, different disciplines. They might not accept the same technical foundations that have driven your own conclusions. They might require a different kind of evidence. Maybe evidence that you wouldn't normally find compelling, like one example or a single case study. And you might like statistical coefficients based on rigorous methodology, but they might like one quote from one person that sends the message, right? So your job is to convince the audience once you've already convinced yourself. And another way to do that is to start with a relatable message. This might mean you don't start at the logical beginning for you. You might start at the logical square one from a storytelling perspective. As I mentioned before, TED Talks almost always begin with a personal story, right, that connect the storyteller to the audience. And that might mean banishing all of your delicate and fully quality checked charts and graphs to the appendix of your presentation. Or it might imply building everything from scratch, which can double the effort, but without it, the impact might be less than half. Another tip, draw upon audience beyond the current project. Your audience doesn't make decisions in a vacuum. If you're part of a presentation to executives, maybe it's part of a full day or a multi-day offsite where they just heard somebody from one discipline and then somebody from finance and then somebody else from HR and then some other outside speaker all talking about stuff. How do you connect it to those things? How do you create a metaphor that connects what you're talking about to the difference between accounting and finance, which is, kind of the difference between execution today and investing in tomorrow or whatever. And you definitely want to drive your audience towards action. Science or technical work can be probabilistic. There is a truth that those with data tend to be less certain about conclusions than those without data, right? Where's the justice in that? People with data see sides of gray. They kind of say, yeah, well, this might tend to relate to this, or sometimes this connects to that, right? But you understand that in science, in pure science, causal relationships are basically unknown. You can amass a weight of evidence, but to say this will lead to this in your case here today, that requires a leap of faith. And so the question is, whose leap of faith is it going to be? Is it going to be yours that you help guide people? Is it going to be you walk out of the room and leave people to their own devices? If they don't feel that action, if they don't have the confidence in the action to act on what you're saying, nothing will happen. So how do you drive your audience towards action? And then lastly, certainly deliver an engaging narrative. Research tip again, facts and figures can make you seem smart, but stories will make you seem compelling. And with that, I'm going to drive towards an end. We are delighted that on our website, actually it's listed on the side here, OV-CVO. This is a companion website to the book that Jeff mentioned. There's a little assessment for each chapter, and if you go to chapter 13, you will see the section on storytelling. And I won't run through all of these things, but it helps you evaluate your own organization and stories that are around you and how it works. So to bring all this together, let me see if I can put all this on one map, one page for you. At the risk of being a little over cutesy and cartoony, you've got a message, you want to connect it to your audience. The dotted straight line is not always the way you want to go. So you have this winding path that might be guided by your compass of 4 truths to the teller, the audience, the moment, and the mission. And you might cruise around the general forest of detailed trees, and you might take the metaphoric fork in the road past the retelling of the meandering creek and clearly avoiding the burning bog of melodrama, and then passing the Rubicon of character arc. And I don't want to get too I don't know, simple here, but on one page, this helps recast some of what we've done in this session. So with that, I think we've come to the question and answer part. So Jeff, I don't know if we have any questions that have come in through the session.
So let me give you guys a moment. I have a couple of questions here, but just to remind you, over on your control panel, there's a little tab called questions. And if you'd like to put in a question, you can just click on that and put in your question. But some of the ones we've got lined up here, Scott, say you were in an engineering versus a retail versus hospitality versus food service, whatever, different kinds of organizations. Would you approach the kind of stories you would create or the method of storytelling any different by the type of organization you were in?
Well, you know, I mean, some of the fundamentals exist, and you know, those different organizations. First of all, they have different ways that leaders can connect. You know, one leader at the top of a big retail organization with 300,000 people might do something a little differently than entrepreneurial startup. But you know, each of those organizations sets itself up for different metaphors, right? So, healthcare. I can remember somebody that asked me once about you know, drivers of engagement, and that, you know, different drivers were necessarily related, and they were talking about correlations. And you know, I was talking about how, you know, eating right and exercise might be correlated with one another, but they don't cause one another. And that was just a sort of a brief health example that helped. Everybody kind of gets health, right? But in retail, you know, different concepts of shrinkage or store growth or online channels and stuff like that provide different metaphors for how we talk about things. Or, you know, financial services, I alluded to the difference between, you know, accounting and finance is both use metrics but sort of drive in different directions. In one way, one plays offense and one plays defense. And so different industries lend themselves to different metaphors, and it's always worth stepping back and thinking about how do you connect with people in that industry, and you know, the things they do and concern themselves with day to day often set up metaphorical green fields.
Okay, thanks. There's one question that's here. I'm trying to understand it. Let me read it and see if you can get the gist. Can you comment on the value or risks inherent in nicknames as a brief reminder of the essence of a story? Any pointers? I guess the question is, I'm not actually not sure what the question is.
You know, let me take a shot at it. You know, even in org vitality, we talk about the Uncle Ben rule sometimes, right? With great power comes great responsibility. And oftentimes that is set up on, you know, the more you can slice and dice data, the more there's power, but also the more there's risk that an individual's survey responses might be compromised. So the more power you have, the more it's your responsibility to be aware of and maintain confidentiality. So the Uncle Ben rule, depending on who you're talking to in org vitality, you just might sort of invoke Uncle Ben and people kind of know what you're talking about. That's a shortcut that invokes a story that has been told before. And I think that it's like a brief meta story or an abbreviated label for a story or a reminder. And I'm not sure if that's what the question was really asking for, but I think it's one of those hallmarks of a culture where, you know, you drive towards your own lingo. You drive towards these kinds of things that allow us to invoke paragraphs of discussion with just a phrase.
So we have time for maybe just one or two more. You talk about using stories to describe an organization. Do you find that the stories can also change the attitudes of the people in the organization?
Yeah, you know, there's that research that talks about how people who tell stories tend to be more committed to an organization. You know, we don't know yet what's the chicken and what's the egg. You know, does telling a story change some people's attitudes? There's also, you know, a lot of research on gossip, which is one kind of story that can be, you know, maybe a little distracting or destructive. But it's either way, you can play it for good. And you know, especially, you know, creating events that tell stories. These things are interwoven, opinions and stories and opinions and action and values. You know, it's like you want them all kind of like that wallet and feet and mouth and, you know, moving in the same direction. You want to get all these things aligned. No one thing is going to change culture or change the fate of your organization, but you get all these things moving together, and that's where you want to be.
All right, thank you. We are at the time. So there are a couple of questions we didn't get to. If you'd like, we'll respond to those separately. We do have a couple of upcoming webinars we'd like to just mention, particularly March 13th. We have one coming on sexual harassment, using surveys to assess risk and support meaningful conversations. This webinar will actually be co-sponsored by Org Vitality and Diversity Inc. So we're looking forward to that webinar quite a bit. As you exit today's webinar, there's going to be a short little survey, and we'd greatly appreciate it if you take the time to complete the survey. Scott, any concluding comments?
Well, thank you all, and I just encourage you to step back and try to remember one metaphor or example or mini story from today, and try it out later on. Thanks, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.